Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we're going to take a stab at a controversial question, muddied by myths and propaganda. That is, was the Waffen SS elite? This is a big topic and a topic that comes up all the time when you deal with the Second World War, and in particular, of course, naturally, the German side. So, Jesse, what's your experience? What's your view of this idea that the Waffen SS was an elite force?
Well, you're right. I mean, it's something that comes up all the time when you're dealing with public history, with pop history, if you will, or even in history products like games, strategy games, computer games, first-person shooter games, whatever kind of game it is, whether it's on a tabletop or online, you have very often the SS portrayed as an elite. Their units have more hit points and all that kind of thing. But you also hear it from people who are interested in history. You can see it online in any number of different forums or websites, or it's on YouTube. If you search Waffen SS, well, Waffen SS in English, I guess. We're going to use the German pronunciation for the way for today, by the way, folks, in the spirit of both sides of the wire. Of course, there are many videos with this clickbaity title on YouTube as well. I even heard it from, I remember this was years ago, two former German soldiers. They had served in the regular German army in the 2000s. And afterwards, we met on another project and we're discussing, historical topics. And they said, yeah, the SS kind of bad, but purely militarily, they all fought to the bitter end. And that is the kind of idea that we're going to get into today and pick apart and see, were those two former soldiers onto something, or were they kind of just repeating an old propaganda myth? So, in order to unpack this kind of question, I think we first have to get an idea of what we're talking about in terms of what we mean when we say Waffen SS. What is this organization? Let's define it a little, get our teeth into it a little, and what is elite? So Matthias, why don't you get us started with a brief overview of the Waffen SS, because it's a bit of a slippery fish, so to speak, to define.
It is very much so. And the problem, of course, is the moment you start talking about anything to do with World War II, in particular, the Germans, the Nazis, doing it in two or three sentences is quite difficult because everything is highly complex and confusing, and also confused at what the Germans do. So perhaps take us back a little bit and look at the structure of the Nazi party and the different branches that they have. So we have the Nazi party itself. It's a political party. But we also have two, you might say, paramilitary wings within this. And this is first of all the SA. That's the big organization. Hundreds of thousands of people joined that. The Schutzabteilung. And that's, it's a bit like a paramilitary one. It's some people perhaps in those days would have said it's a bit like a working man's club. It's much more than that, but that's how some people understood it as well. And that's the big organization, which is very, very influential up to 1934. Because what you have in Germany is the rivalry between Hitler and the army on the one hand, and the guy who runs the SA, a chap called Röhm, Ernst Röhm, who's actually one of the very, very few people who was allowed to call Hitler by the colloquial du. So he used the first name. They weren't first name terms. Very, very unusual. Didn't happen very often with Hitler. And they've got about 500,000 men. And Röhm says, well, we need to have another big revolution. We need to do away with this class-based structure of the state and also the military. Most of the officers at that time still came from the aristocracy, and we need to have a proper people's army. This is the SA. And this worries Hitler, but also the army, because they want to be the armed force within Germany. And in 1934, it comes to what's called the Night of the Long Knives, where Röhm and lots of other people get assassinated by Hitler, and it's over. And one of the main organizations which carries this out, all these killings, is the SS. The SS starts in the 1920s, and it's the personal bodyguard of Hitler. We need to go back to the period of the Weimar Republic. You have all these different parties, you have all these different factions, and it was very, very normal, in inverted commas, at that particular time, that when you had a party rally, that another party would actually go in there, storm it, and there were lots of fist fights, and the beer halls in Munich would get destroyed, and what have you. So Hitler has got his own personal bodyguard, and that's originally the SS. It's a very small organization, to begin with only a handful of people. It then becomes a bit bigger, and that's on the 17th of March 1933. They form the personal bodyguard consisting of 120 men. Not more than that at that particular stage. And it becomes more important after this Night of Long Knives in 1934. And then it grows in importance to finally become this big fighting organization. On the one hand, the Waffen SS, that's the military branch and the military arm of the SS. But you also have the General SS. And again, you need to break down what happens in the General SS. So in there, for example, you find to a large degree the people who were guarding the concentration camps. They came from the Allgemeine SS. There were also, in a different area, a different branch, a lot of very highly educated people, a lot of academics, because they couldn't find jobs anywhere else. They went into the SS, the General SS, because there were, for example, a lot of research projects being carried out. To give you one obscure example, if you're interested in witches and witchcraft and witch hunts in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, even today, what you need to do is you need to consult the sources that were compiled in the 1930s by the General SS, because Himmler, as the head of the SS, has got this thing about Germanic mythology. So he sends out people to gather all this information, and they put together a big, big file in which every single case relating to witchcraft in the German-speaking world in the 15th, 16th, 17th century is compiled. So you can see all sorts of different things that go on in the SS. But what's important for us is, of course, the Waffen SS, which then develops later on outside of this personal bodyguard and is the military arm comes into play here.
Right. And from that small bodyguard, it grows into a massive parallel army, if you will, to the regular German army, working hand in hand with them, but following a somewhat different command structure and with certainly different origins, as you mentioned, and partly serving a dual purpose, because there's an ideological purpose, of course, as well. They're supposed to be the vanguard of the Nazi Party and the standard bearers of its ideology, just in case the regular army is not quite Nazi enough for the leaders. So the other side of the coin, now that we have a bit of a better idea about the Waffen SS, this armed branch of the Nazi Party, if you will, that grows and grows, as we'll discuss in a moment, exactly how that growth happens and what impact it has on our question today. But of course, the other aspect of the question is, what is elite in this military context? And I think I came across a very short and pithy definition that I think goes some of the way to establishing what we mean with elite. It's not the ones with the fanciest uniforms. It's not the ones with the best TikTok videos today, like, I don't know, the Chechens or what have you in the Russian army. What it is, it's the ability to achieve military goals quickly and efficiently. That is, with minimal or as few as possible military losses. This includes some kind of skill or a whole bunch of skill, depending on how elite you want to be, in tactics, in the use of equipment and weapons, in the esprit de corps, with discipline, with morale, and with unit cohesion and things like that. There's a much longer list, of course, but basically, can you achieve your goals effectively, and do you know what you're doing? So that's military elite. With the SS, of course, with the Waffen SS, we also have sometimes the question of, okay, are they a military elite? I think that's the most common question surrounding this, but there's also the idea that the Nazis have that they're going to be this ideological and racial elite, at least at first. And we'll get into some of those changes later. And one aspect of this is the idea that some people have that fanaticism, ideological fanaticism, will make the Waffen SS into better fighters, or anybody into a better fighter. And I think that's a bit of a questionable assumption, but it's in the mix. It's part of this idea of the Waffen SS as elite, and you hear that sometimes. This idea of the SS as an elite doesn't come from nowhere. It's not sort of the result of some sort of official document, the work of decades of research by historians. It's got all sorts of other origins and sources that flow into this idea. Why are we even discussing why the Waffen SS is an elite, right? Well, part of it, I think, goes back to Nazi era propaganda, right? They wanted to be seen as an elite. And Himmler, who is the head of the SS during the war, wants more internal prestige and power for his organization, right? So he presents it as the elite internally as well to Hitler and to the German public, of course. I came across an amazing statistic, at least it was amazing for me, because the SS had their own propaganda offices as well, the Waffen SS did. So in 1941, big year in the war, right? Big year for the Waffen SS as well, because they begin to expand, as we'll come to in a moment here. But the Waffen SS is about 5% of German troops in the field in 1941 in the East. But they get between 30 and 40% of the press coverage. So that is a huge discrepancy, and one of the reasons why this legend comes about of them, or this concept becomes familiar to us of them becoming an elite.
And this legend, this myth, as you've already said, well, is still with us today. I remember being invited to a reenactment happening in the UK a few years ago. And
the reenactors.
Exactly. I'm just going to let me just finish the story because it works quite well in this context that we're talking about. So I walked in and they were refighting something like 1945 battle in Germany. And I walked up there and it was really funny. So I walk up to the gate and out goose steps someone in 1945 German uniform, and a very broken German says to me, "Papiere bitte," so papers please. So I presented my papers and they said, "Well, just drive around the corner, they're all there." So I drove around the corner and there were it felt like about 1,000 people, of whom one was dressed as a Brit, 2 were dressed as American soldiers, and 997 were dressed as Waffen SS soldiers. So you can see it absolutely, this myth is still very much there. When I talk to people, exactly as you just said, it's not about the political side of things. It's all about the military prowess, the elite status as military fighters. You've already started to unpick an awful lot of this, and I think this is one of the real issues. You're, of course, absolutely right. When the SS is there as a very small organization, it then gains influence, a little bit of power internally within the Nazi system after 1934. You already mentioned the name, Himmler is there, which again is quite striking, quite interesting, because you've got the SS, they all have to be Aryan. You have to trace back your German non-Jewish Aryan lineage all the way up to 1800. So you're supposed to be very tall and blonde, and Himmler's everything but not tall and blonde. I've said this before, no one's ever picked up on these things, which is quite funny. But when you look at the people that they want to get in and the people that they want to have as Waffen SS members, they do look for the physical elite, at least to begin with. So in 1934, for example, I've already said it, you have to be able to trace back your German Aryan ancestry all the way back to 1800. You have to be unmarried. You're not allowed to have a criminal record. You have to be physically fit. That, for example, also meant no tooth fillings. You had to be in between 17 and 23 years of age. You had to be at least 1.74 meters tall, and you had to have 20/20 eyesight. So that is physically, at least, you might say, is a bit of an elite. That gets watered down quite quickly in 1938. The height restriction is limited. You're now allowed to have up to 6 fillings. So you can see how they all begin to change this. And of course, this is before the war even breaks out. When the war breaks out, you already talked about other areas and other groups. We come back to them later on, the non-Germanic groups. But there are more changes, and perhaps one of the most drastic changes that hardly one ever talks about is the fact that from 1944 onwards, the Waffen SS would also take conscripts. Up to that stage, it's completely a volunteer organization. In 1944, the system changes. And there are numerous accounts of young people, normally told, encouraged by their parents, who volunteer to join in particular the army, because the army in the German system, the military system, is still seen as a bastion of conservatism against Nazism, because they do not want to get drafted into the Waffen SS. There was a very famous case, a very famous German writer, Günter Grass, who was, in inverted commas, found out shortly before his death that he had actually served in the Waffen SS. And that caused a bit of a public outcry back in Germany. And when you look at the press coverage, you already mentioned it, because this is the embodiment of the new regime. This is what you want. You also, of course, have within Germany the antagonism between the old elite and particularly the army, because the army is still at that stage, up to the second half of World War II, still very much class-based. So the vast majority of senior officers, they are from the aristocracy. Whereas the Nazi system has a very different idea. So there is socialism in there, and that also applies to the Waffen SS. Perhaps the best example of this is basically the guy who founds the whole thing, who becomes the first military commander. It's a chap called Sepp Dietrich. Sepp Dietrich in the First World War is a corporal in the Bavarian artillery. So he doesn't have any officer training, he doesn't have any staff training, nothing at all. And he becomes the leading figure because he so embodies and absorbs this whole Nazi ideology that he is seen by Hitler as the great new military commander, the embodiment of the new Germany, the new social structure. Which also means, of course, when you look at what the army people had to say about his command and particularly staff work abilities, they thought it was all completely abysmal. So there is an awful lot of myth around this, which was started deliberately, of course, in that particular time, and then brought forward to the modern day. And you already talked a little bit about equipment, for example, the equipment that they got. So talk us through the equipment a bit more. That's the Waffen SS units got.
Yeah, well, very often they were first in line for equipment as the war went on. But having more equipment doesn't necessarily make you better trained in using it, make your commanders more skilled in directing you, and it doesn't necessarily make you into an elite automatically. So yes, one of the aspects, for example, is they lobbied extremely hard internally to be turned into, once they had divisions, we're skipping ahead a bit here to the massive expansion, which we'll go over in a little more detail. They lobbied very hard to become armored formations, to get tanks, right? Once they have Waffen SS divisions into the war, and then they get more and more of them, they lobby very hard that these divisions should be armored, they should get tanks, they should get the newest, biggest, baddest, most Naziest tanks or whatever. Which they often do because it's seen as being more prestigious. Now, of course, this is a part of the mix of, are you an elite just because you have fancy equipment, or can you actually do something with it? But I wanted to slow us down for a second. Now we're talking about divisions and armored divisions and so on, but I think it's worthwhile as part of answering this question of are they a military elite or not, to go through this process of expansion. So before I do, one little interjection. On this podcast, our job is not to get into some of the modern political questions that are out there, but I would say on the topic of Nazi approaches to class, right, and the aristocratic officers, and then they have a more egalitarian idea. I would also say, I would just like to add that I think that the Nazi concept of racial unity is a big push behind that, right? Not only about class as a concept that has the same word as, say, Marxist idea of class, but that the race shouldn't have these kinds of distinctions in it, which is a bit different than your typical socialist idea. Anyhow, that little political digression aside, let's talk about the expansion now in a little bit more detail, because I think this is critical, right, to our question of are they elite or not? Can you be elite, for example, when in 1938 you have 20,000 men in your Waffen SS organization, but by May 1945, according to some estimates, you have over 800,000. So a lot of those 800,000 are going to have a lot of fillings. They're going to be shorter than 1 meter 74, and in fact, they're not even going to be German by the end of the war. So you have a numerical expansion that's massive. One of the big tipping points for that expansion is in 1944, but there were also other periods of expansion. 1941, when the Soviet invasion or the invasion of the Soviet Union happens, then they start running short on people, right? They start running short on trained officers. They had very limited training capacities up until 1941. So you end up expanding, for military reasons, but also for reasons of, political power struggle. And you end up diluting, in a sense, the skill pool, the talent pool that you're working with, not only for these ideas of racial purity or whatever, but also just for pure military skill and experience.
Military skill and experience, of course, is the key word here. And when you look at the history of the Waffen SS, it's quite striking to see that in the very early days, so the early campaigns, particularly France 1940, the army itself, so not the Waffen SS, but the army, was very, very critical of the performance of the what in those days was called the SS-Verfügungstruppe, which in good German tradition is one long word. So if you can pronounce that and write that down, Jesse, you're excluded. Any of our listeners, well, I'll buy you a drink when I meet you. And that in those days was the Leibstandarte plus 2 regiments, and that was Germania and Deutschland. That's the SS-Verfügungstruppe. And at that stage, they still came under the army command. So they're commanded by superior army commanders. And they are shocked by the lack of training. At that stage, also the lack of equipment, because the army didn't really want to give anything to them. And it's only after this, as you've already mentioned, that there's a change, and suddenly they get the best equipment. They have a very high proportion of these very efficient Panzergrenadier and also tank divisions. You already mentioned this. Now, when you just look at the sheer size of it, so you start with the first division, which is the Leibstandarte. You then have the if that's the right word, the famous or perhaps infamous or well-known one. So it's Leibstandarte. Then the second one is Das Reich. The third one is Totenkopf. So the Death Head. This division consisted originally to a large degree of people who had previously been guarding concentration camps. You then have a police division. And then you already start getting into the non-German bit, because the fifth one is the Viking division, which translates as Viking. And you have a lot of Scandinavians in there. You then have the North Division, which is a mountain warfare division, and so on and so forth. Perhaps I don't want to give you all the 38 names of all the 38 divisions that we have in the end, but the famous ones perhaps are Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, 9 and 10. People might have heard about before because they play a role in Normandy, and then, of course, during the Battle of Arnhem. And to throw in some other ones, you've got the 27th is the Langemark Division, which consists of Flemish volunteers. It's not a divisional strength. So a German division at that stage, depending on what type of division it is, should have between 15,000 and 18,000 men. These are much, much smaller, but still it's classed as a division because of political and propaganda reasons. You also have the Charlemagne division, that's number 33, which is the very famous one because these guys, together with Nordland, are defending Hitler in the bunker in 1945. So you can see there is this watering down. In 1940, they open up the ranks for Germanic non-Germans, so to speak. So that's in particular Flemish people, that's the Scandinavians. And then the second next big push comes in 1942, because at that stage, the Germans are realizing, hang on, the war's going to last longer than we anticipated. We're running out of manpower. We need more men. And this is when they start looking at the non-Aryans, and they put them into different divisions. So there is troops from the Eastern Front. There are people put together in a division from the Balkans. So there's all sorts of stuff going on, which is interesting because you already said you've got a racial aspect here. So this is supposed to be the absolute elite of Germanic blood. No feelings. And suddenly you get all these people and that you set out to defeat, to starve, to drive off their land. So really from a pure racial point of view, it doesn't really make any sense. Of course, the reason why they end up in the Waffen SS is twofold. Well, the first one is because Himmler wants to have a second army, you might say, next to the normal army, the normal armed force, as big as possible. And by 1942, he says, okay, if that means we need to have a different structure, different composition, I'm willing to accept this. And the other one, of course, is that by this stage, well, basically, they simply need the manpower. And you can't get these men into the German army because in order to serve in the German army, you have to be a German citizen. That is still very much the case today. Unlike other armies, even today, where you can join when you don't have the right sort of passport of that army. In the German case, you need to be a citizen of Germany in order to serve within the army. So there's a legal aspect to the whole thing as well. But you can see how this really changes the entire composition. You go from this very small, self-perceived elite army, which in the early stage of the war was not seen as very good by the army. Of course, there's also a little bit of political struggle here, because the army realizes if these guys get too powerful, that's bad for us, to then the perceived elite, to then basically watering it down and just having a very, very big second army. So a very, very interesting development that you find in the history of the SS.
Yeah, and by the end of the war, of course, they don't only extend eligibility criteria to so-called Germanic peoples, they extend it even to what they call Germanizable peoples, like Latvians and Estonians, for example, who are not, as far in their mind from the German race as some other races in their worldview. But then they also take in others as well. So they've even got a Ukrainian Waffen SS unit, for example. Slavs, Ukrainians are Slavs. These are supposed to be the Untermenschen in the Nazi ideology, right? The subhuman peoples. And nonetheless, they're still able and willing to recruit them, as well as, of course, many other countries. France, for example, a so-called Latin people, another inferior race.
There is also a British unit, which not a lot of people know about. So that's the St. George, well, they want to call it division, but it's not a division. I don't have the exact figures and numbers, but if I remember correctly, it consists of something between 9 and 14 people. It was very famous because these guys dressed in their SS uniforms would just get into the bars and pubs in Germany and start fistfights. So after a few months, that unit was disbanded because they thought, well, the propaganda value stands in no relation to all the destroyed pubs and bars in Germany. So let's not deal with that. So that experiment didn't go particularly well from the German point of view, but in many other countries it did. And it's really quite interesting to see, I always find, when you go back to that particular time, how widespread the support for this really was, not only in Germany, but this whole idea of fighting against Bolshevism, fighting against communism, found an awful lot of support. So when you look at the Eastern Front on the whole, that's not a Waffen SS thing now, from 1943 onwards, about a third of the troops fighting there in German uniform are not even German. And there are a number of very interesting examples. I can give you two from the Dutch nation. So a few months ago, I was involved in a research project, absolutely fascinating, with an Australian lady, and she was trying to find out more about her parents' generation that emigrated from the Netherlands. And what a fascinating story, because her father had joined the Dutch resistance, whereas her uncle had joined the Waffen SS and was killed in Berlin, or close to Berlin, in 1945. And another story, a friend of the family, his father, he was Dutch, and was arrested in the 60s or 70s, don't know exactly, when he tried to get back into the Netherlands, because he'd also joined the Waffen SS, and he'd then gone around kicking in doors in the Netherlands, trying to find Jews and other resistance fighters. So you can see there's an awful lot of that going on as well. Of course, after 1945, no one wanted to talk about this anymore, for obvious reasons. But this whole idea of Nazism, of the ideology that the Waffen SS stands for, found much more approval than people think today.
Yeah, because they expanded that ideological identity, right? So in mid-war, this idea of representing the best of the German race as an ideology morphs and becomes more inclusive. I hesitate to use the word that way, but more expansive, to a kind of general European anti-Bolshevik, anti-Semitic type of organization. And those feelings of anti-Bolshevism and anti-Semitism are fairly widespread, as you mentioned, in other European societies. So that helped with some of the foreign recruitment. By the end of the war, about 500,000 non-Germans serve in the Waffen SS. And most of those are from peoples, nations, cultures east of Germany, which is quite interesting. By 1943, I want to kind of bring together this expansion idea, both militarily and ideologically here. By 1943, the Waffen SS has 17 divisions. I mean, that is massive. 17 field divisions from what started as a bodyguard, right, back in the 1930s. And in order to try to maintain some of the distinctions, because they know that they're watering down their organization, they divide it into 3 different tiers. So there's a bit of a complicated naming system, but you can tell from the name of the division if it's an SS military division, if it's a Germanic division of Germanic so-called volunteers, or if it's a Waffen SS division of foreigners. Right? So they try to make these internal distinctions to keep some degree of, well, yeah, we're all an elite, so-called elite in the Waffen SS, but well, we belong to the top tier of that elite, and so on and so forth. So it gets more complicated. Of course, they also begin to recruit younger Germans. And there's one, for Canadians anyway, like me, one very famous example, which is the 12th SS Division, which is made up of teenagers, mostly, not their officers and so not their commanders, but the rank and file are mostly between 16 and 18 years old by the time they see action in Normandy. And on a personal note, my grandfather and several of my great uncles were serving in the Canadian military in the Second World War, land as a part of the Normandy invasion, not on the first day, not on the beaches, but shortly thereafter in the Normandy campaign. And my grandfather's first combat experience was against 16, 17, and 18-year-olds of the 12th SS Division. So I think that's a little clue as to, can you really call yourself an elite when you're part of what you hope to be the greatest army of all time, and you're recruiting 16-year-olds to fight against a fully equipped, fresh, 4 years of training Canadian Infantry Division? So that I think that takes us in a little bit to the discussion of, what is their track record like, the Waffen SS, on the battlefield? Do they do what they say they're doing in those 30% of press reports?
When you look, as I've said before, you look at the early performance, particularly in 1940, people are actually not overly impressed. It really changes in 1941, fighting in the East. But you need to understand, as you've already said and we've discussed, that at this stage, these formations are now getting the best equipment. So they are very, very strong. They have good equipment. They've got the newest tanks. They've got a higher number of tanks, normally the tank divisions, than normal army division would have. So just that in itself gives you an advantage. Of course, you also have then the fanaticism, in particular with the younger ones. You talked about the Hitler Youth Division, the Hitlerjugend. So these are guys who did not know anything apart from Nazi ideology. Of course, they're going to fight very hard because they're 16 to 18, so they think they're invincible. There's a fascinating after-action report from the Hitler Youth Division fighting in Normandy, actually. And it opens up with the line, "Tommy is no soldier." And then it says, the Brits are afraid of the cold steel of the bayonet, and the moment our machine guns start firing, they start to run away. And you read this and you think, wow, this is heroic, isn't it? Isn't that brilliant? So this sums up everything what the SS stands for. This is the heroism, it's the fanaticism, there we are. And then you start to think it through, and you think, actually, you know what? This is utterly stupid. Because what they're doing here is they're putting the bodies of, in that case, the 16 to 18-year-olds with a machine gun against Allied air power, against Allied artillery. And when you put a body against an artillery shell, you know who's going to win. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why they have very, very high casualties. In addition to that, when you go back to what the army said, quite often the people who came through the SS themselves, so not the people who'd served in the army beforehand and then moved across, because there were quite a few of that as well, who'd received the proper staff training. So the people who come through the SS ranks, they're not particularly well trained, quite often. And that is also a reason why quite often the SS has very, very high casualties. Of course, we also need to see if that's the right word to put a positive spin on that, if that is the right word here, because they were seen as even by the Germans, not least for propaganda reasons, as the elite. So they're also used as the so-called fire brigade. Wherever it's really, really tough, wherever the heaviest fighting is, this is where you send these guys. Because that makes sense from a Nazi ideology point of view. Here are the Aryan fighters. They can do it. It makes sense when you look at their structure and equipment, because they did get, in the second half of the war, the better equipment. So it all makes sense from their point of view. And the army was also quite happy to have them there, because they knew they would fight fanatically. And also, if you are an old school army guy, well, you get the SS thugs in. If they all die, no one really cares. I mean, it sounds a bit awful, but that's also part, perhaps, of that particular thinking. So the whole question about the quality and are they really elite as military formations, difficult. What you also find, of course, when you have this fanaticism again, this is directed, of course, at and against the enemy. But it's also directed against your own people if you have to, because you only believe in National Socialism. So you gave a personal example from the Normandy campaign. I have one from France as well. My grandfather, he was in an anti-aircraft unit, and they are withdrawing, probably from your grandfather in 1944. So basically, let's say running away. And say he had a vehicle. He was a signaler, all the radio equipment, and that car broke down. And the car rolls up, and out jump people in camouflage uniforms. And in those days, that normally meant that's the SS. And they said, "What's going on here?" And they said, "Well, car's broken down. We're fixing it. We're on our way. How long do you need?" 5 to 10 minutes. And they said, "You've got exactly 30 seconds because the Americans and the Brits are just over there. So if you don't withdraw, then, you're going to get captured. And so our feeling is that you want to get captured. You don't want to fight for the victory of Greater Germany and National Socialism, all these things." And so the other guy who was fixing the car lying underneath was saying, no, I need 2 or 3 minutes here. And after the 30 seconds, the guy said, "Well, you know what? Your time's up." Went back to the car, took a Panzerfaust and blew up that car with the other guy still lying underneath. So that really shows you the ruthlessness that these guys had as well against the enemy. You can talk about atrocities. You talked about the Canadians, atrocities against Canadians in the Normandy campaign as an example, but also against themselves and other members of their own nation. So absolutely, you might say absolutely shocking what you find there.
Well, I think this speaks to the question of discipline and morale as an aspect of your military skill. If you're a military elite, are you going to be able to be good at being what soldiers are supposed to do in the service of achieving your military goal, right? Waffen SS, military organization, as well as a political organization. And our question is, are they an elite on the battlefield? And I think that discipline and morale question plays into that. Infamously, of course, the SS is famous for all sorts of executions of enemy civilians, of its own people, as you mentioned, of Canadian troops in Normandy, for example. There are a couple of very famous ones, of British troops in 1940, as we mentioned in another episode that we covered. So I think if we're considering this question of are they military elite, well, if they are undisciplined, if they don't apply force in a measured manner to achieve their objectives, then I think that's one element that speaks against labeling them as elite.
This is very true. But of course, from their point of view, it would have been very, very different. Because to them, what matters is, first of all, achieving the military aim and objective. And we have seen in recent years, particularly with the end of the Cold War in the Western world, this perception that you can fight wars without casualties. And that is wrong. When you fight a big major war, you need to accept casualties. Do they have to be as bad? Do you have to really want to sustain casualties, you might even say? That, of course, is wrong. But this acceptance of casualties was much higher in all armies at that particular time. And then, of course, the next point is, again, the question of ideology. So when they go around and start shooting prisoners of war, both on the Western Front and the Eastern Front, to them, that's not really a breakdown of morale, of discipline. But to them, that is really fulfilling the aim, because what they want to do is achieve total victory. Their oath is personal loyalty to Hitler. If Hitler says this is what you need to do, this is what I expect from you, it's all about ruthless fighting against our enemy. They see that within their slightly perverse, you might say, worldview and world picture as absolutely sound.
On the other hand, they don't always fight to the bitter end. And this, I think, is another aspect that sometimes gets lost in the discussion of the elites, in the computer game values attached to SS units or what have you, or in the perception of my two ex-German army acquaintances, is that many SS units run away. Sometimes, many. I don't want to exaggerate here. Of course, there are many examples of them actually fighting to the bitter end in different tactical or operational situations, but there are also examples of them fleeing. And to me, that's a part of this question as well. I've got a quote here. I was just searching for it a little bit in my notes as we were speaking. During the Battle of Berlin, which, by the way, if you're interested in, we have a previous episode out on it, so a little self-promotion here. You have the German commander who is one of the German commanders, let's say, who's supposed to be in the overall defense of Berlin before things go completely crazy, General Heinrizi, who is complaining. He writes a letter to General Manteuffel, who's responsible for forces just north of the city, in late April. And he's complaining because SS troops are retreating in an ill-disciplined manner. And so I have a short excerpt from this letter. So this is Heinrizi to Manteuffel in April 1945. SS men from Division Wallonien, Langemark, Nordland, who by the thousands are on the move from Neubrandenburg towards the west, they are hordes, riding on motor vehicles, even in columns. Terrible disaster is underway. Do everything you can. Tomorrow morning, no SS man may ride on motor vehicles towards the west. Now, this is one snapshot. I'm not trying to say that every SS unit ran away all the time. That's not realistic. You've pointed out other examples. We all know of other examples if we've read a little bit about the military performance of the SS. But I do think that this kind of example breaks into that part of the legend that they're elite by showing that, yeah, sometimes not only did they lack discipline, maybe in an ideological sense that's debatable, as you pointed out, but in a fairly objective sense, they also retreated sometimes.
And there's also another interesting point, in fact, coming back to this particular quote, because the formations that he quotes here are those that have, at least in theory, a relatively high percentage of non-Germans in it. So you can already see how he is, perhaps to a degree, already building up a defense. So yes, we were holding the front line, but we were, to use the First World War example, stabbed in the back by the non-Germans who started running away, and that brought the entire front line to collapse. That, of course, is also there. So it's very easy to use these guys as scapegoats as well. So perhaps another factor here, because by that stage, everyone, even as this guy, could see that the game is up.
Indeed, and as far as training goes, something I wanted to mention earlier and it slipped my mind, just going through the different aspects here, I think, of elite or no, right? So we have them retreating sometimes, we have debatable discipline questions, but one other is about this training that you talked about earlier. And I came across an example where in 1942, the Das Reich division discovers, hey, you know what? We're not as good as we need to be. We're not even as skilled as the Soviets that were fighting on the Eastern Front. And so they undertake like a supplementary new training program for their men so that they can become better in fighting in forests, in fighting at night, in camouflage, and here we have the magical word discipline again, in fire discipline. They want to reduce those sort of pointless losses if they can, and learn some of the skills that they found they're lacking because the enemy was better in them. So I think that to me was one good sort of large unit-sized example of, hey, here's what we're lacking. We're obviously not the elite at that snapshot at that moment in time.
And in addition to this pure military training, there's also lots of other stuff, of course, that goes on. So one little episode that always makes me smile is from the Normandy front, actually, in 1944. So the fighting's going on, but there's a bit of a lull in the fighting. And one divisional commander from one SS division writes a letter to another SS division, and he demands that the divisional mascot, a pig, is handed back to this division because the other division has stolen it. So sometimes you think, well, how busy are you fighting a war and training to get better at things when you still got time for this? So that always makes me smile and laugh.
Indeed. Leave it to the German to come up with the stories of related to pork. And eventually that story, if we continue it long enough, folks, would have gone towards sausages. But that is another topic for another day.
You can think of something with beer as well. Yeah,
obviously, the two are meant to go together. But we digress yet again. I think we've gone through quite a bit of the different aspects of this question of, are they an elite? Are they not an elite? We talked about the expansion. We talked about the political aspect, kind of interfering or interacting with their identity as a military organization. We talked about equipment. We talked about training. And I think what all of these things show us is that the question is not that simple. I know that's a typical historian kind of thing to say, oh, it's more complicated. But it is, right? The Waffen SS becomes a massive, massive organization. And I think I think you'll agree with me, Matthias, if I go so far as to say, as a whole, we cannot say that the Waffen SS was elite. Different parts of it at different times. Probably, I think we can fairly say you could consider parts of it at different times as parts of a military elite, but there were also regular army units that you might have been able to consider as a military elite as well. And that other parts of it weren't elite at the beginning, weren't elite at the end, or were never elite at all.
And because it's such a big organization by the end, 800,000 to 900,000 men, just think about the sheer size. Compare that to the size of armies in the West today. So we don't have anything like this. So 38 divisions, even though they're not all at full strength. Most European countries have perhaps 2 or 3 divisions. That's it today. So just within that sheer size, immediately begin to see and understand that all of these actually can be complete elite. And after the war, one of the famous SS commanders, Paul Hauser, he writes a book and it's called Soldiers Like Others Too, Soldaten wie andere auch. And of course, his idea as to why he's chosen the title is because of political reasons. So he said, well, not all diehard Nazis, they're just very good soldiers, they're fighting like others as well. But the title, of course, also suggests, if you put this twist and turn on it, that exactly as you said, like in the normal Wehrmacht, you have units that are better and formations, and you have some that are worse. So soldiers like others too. I wouldn't agree with that in the ideological sense, but when you look at the pure military performance, despite all the propaganda that we have and the myths surrounding it, I think that is probably a fair assessment.
And so to top off our discussion of whether the Waffen SS was an elite, I think I'll leave us with a quote from a couple of German authors who wrote a book based on secret recordings of German prisoner of war conversations made by the British. And they conclude about the Waffen SS that an occasionally greater willingness to follow orders to the letter and fight to the death is the lone, if significant, difference between SS men and regular soldiers. And I think we can say that on the military side of things. Obviously, as we discussed, ideologically, there are more differences, perhaps, to some extent, between the regular army and the Waffen SS. But nonetheless, that's our take on the question of whether the Waffen SS can be considered an elite or not. Let us know. What did you think about that? Do you agree with us in whole, in part? Leave us a comment. Before we go today, though, we're going to add a new feature to today's podcast. Some of you have sent in questions to us, so thank you very much for those of you who sent in questions. And we selected one at random, and we're going to give it an answer today. And our listener question today, surprise, surprise, when we're talking about World War II, it's about Hitler. And this particular listener writes to us, and he or she is curious about Hitler's family. What kind of family did he have? Or in particular, this person asks, what happened to Hitler's family after the war? Spoiler alert, his wife didn't survive the war. She killed herself in the bunker with him on April 30th. But other than that, Matthias, what can you share with us about Hitler's relatives?
Well, just like always, family history is always quite complex and difficult. I think perhaps the most interesting aspect, actually looking at Hitler's family, is going back a little bit and looking at his parents. So his father, he was called Alois Hitler. He was a customs officer, Austro-Hungarian one, and he was posted on the Bavarian, i.e. German, Austrian border. And Hitler also in Mein Kampf writes about this and says, well, that was fate that put me there. So I was supposed to bring the two German-speaking countries, so to speak, Germany and Austria, back together. He didn't really like his father. I think he was a bit odd, a bit strange. He loved his mother, a woman called Clara. But what is quite interesting about the family, that's why I want to go there, and perhaps the listeners already know this story, is that Alois Hitler, who was also called at that time Hitler, they had all sorts of different types of writing, changed his name in 1877. And only from that moment onwards, the family is actually called Hitler. And that was because of an inheritance. So his real name was Alois Schicklgruber. Now, just imagine everyone shouting Heil Schicklgruber. That sounds really, really weird, particularly in Germany, because Schicklgruber is not a particularly, at least northern German name. So a bit of a funny side to the whole thing. He did have, so Adolf Hitler had a number of siblings, half-siblings, because his father was married several times. He had lots of children with his wife, so he was married 3 times. So the first one, for example, is Alois Hitler, so named after the father. He's the half-brother. He lives from 1882 to 1956. Quite interesting because apparently he also spent some time in the UK, in Liverpool. So the news stories in the UK tell us that the house he lived in was then destroyed by German bombing during the war. Well, that's quite true or not, I don't know. He then ran a number of restaurants in Berlin. And after the war, just like most members of the Hitler family, tries to basically not raise his head over the parapet too much and keeps a very low profile, then dies in 1956. His half-sister, Angela Hitler, she was the one he really liked. And she was the only one who was quite close to him when he was the chancellor, because he kept her in his household, and she basically looked after his personal belongings. She looked basically was a bit like a maid. That's how she worked, and so she was close. All the other ones he didn't really like. He never wanted to talk about his family upbringing. So shroud and cloud of mystery over the whole thing. But she lives from 1883 to 1949. She's arrested after the war, then very quickly is released. Never renounces Nazism and these things. Says, no, my brother, he was a great guy. And then she dies, and that's it. He also has a sister, Paula Hitler. Pretty much the same story there. So she never renounced the whole Nazi idea. And she then basically, in obscurity, more or less, dies in 1960. You also have a nephew, also very interesting character, a chap called William Patrick Hitler. As you can already hear, there's an English name, so it was actually called William, not Wilhelm, and he actually immigrates into the US. So he doesn't want anything to do with the whole Nazi concept. And perhaps in addition to Eva Braun, you already mentioned her, his wife that he marries in the bunker, and then they commit suicide. What a great wedding present that is. There was one other woman, another girl, you might say, from his family that played a very, very important role, and that is Geli Raubal, and that's his niece. And she's born in 1908. And there are lots of discussions, there are lots of myths, there are lots of different interpretations, whether Hitler actually had an affair with her or not, or there was something going on. What we do know is that he really loved her to bits. And she lived in his flat in Munich, which, by the way, is now a police station. So you can actually go, when you want to report a crime in a specific part of Munich, you actually go into Hitler's old flat and you can report it there. And she commits suicide there in 1931. Again, different interpretations as to why. Is it because, well, she didn't feel loved by him in whatever shape or form? Is it because that's what the accounts from the time say? He more or less locked her up. Whatever it was, she killed herself in 1939. He keeps the room exactly as it was at the time of her death, and no one apart from him is ever allowed to enter this room. So again, it's a bit like a shrine. So, cut a long story short, with the end of the war, the whole Hitler family, where they don't disappear because they still survive, but they keep a low profile, and basically they then, let's put it that way, they die out. And that's the end of the Hitler lineage. So there are not an awful lot of Hitlers left.
So there you have it, folks. Our first ever listener question. The Hitler line dies out after the war. Perhaps in some ways a fitting end for it. In any case, that was it for today's episode. Let us know what you thought and send us questions if you have any as well. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. It's about Hitler.
Yay!
And this particular you totally threw me off there, man. That was
Very good.
I love that half-hearted yay.